Great to see everybody coming in. Indeed, no faces, but I can see all the names dropping in. And thank you and welcome to all of our panelists. And thank you, Rebecca, for facilitating this webinar. I'm not going to take much of your time, just to give everybody a warm welcome and thank you all for being here. So I'm Rina, I'm the editor-in-chief of Intervention Journal, and you can find my email on the website, and you're all very welcome to contact me if you have any questions or ideas for intervention, and of course to submit your work for us all to learn about the context that you work in, what you have to share with our little MHPSS community that we have here, which we cherish so much. And just some update from us from Intervention. We celebrated our 20-year anniversary last January. And of course, this last issue that we will discuss today has been also the transition from Wendy as the former editor-in-chief to me. So that's been also a milestone, I would say. And then I was asked to give a summary of the last issue, which is impossible because, I mean, we have 4 authors here, which is great, but there were many more interesting pieces. So I'm not even going to try to highlight because I like them all, and I think you should just all go to the website and have a look. We have many great articles, field reports out there. And maybe also to highlight something I wrote together with Wendy in our editorial, which was about inviting pieces on decolonializing MHPSS, and it's something we warmly welcome. And I think this is also links nicely to the topic of our discussion today. So over to Rebecca, who has been part of our editorial board for a very long time, and who is an independent psychosocial specialist in the MHPSS field, currently in Nepal somewhere, hosting this event. So over to you, Rebecca, and thank you. Enjoy, everybody. Oh, and one last thing, you're welcome to put the questions, as Rebecca has said, in the question and answer section, and I will moderate that and pick out some questions to talk about in our panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rina. Yes, so we are hoping to get some interesting discussion. We are certainly going to have some interesting discussion from our panelists, but we'd like to hear from you too. So that question and answer function is there for you to share your thoughts. And as Rina said, she'll be moderating and collecting those questions for us to come to later. So I've mentioned already that the event's being recorded, just so you're aware. You're all automatically muted, but you'll be able to unmute, or you will be unmuted when it's time for you to speak and to share your thoughts and questions later. The way this event is going to take place is, as Rina said, we're really privileged to have 4 of the authors who contributed to the last Intervention Journal issue with us. So we're going to organize this into 2 blocks. We're going to have 2 of the authors share some thoughts about their papers and some issues really that they have in common. We'll have that discussion between the authors and maybe opportunity for a few questions immediately after that. Then we'll come to the other 2 authors. And again, they have some things in common, which they'll discuss between them. And again, we'll have an opportunity for some questions immediately after that related to those specific issues that have been raised there. What we're going to do after that is then have some kind of wrap-up questions or wrap-up messages from the panel. And that will take us to the 1-hour mark. At that point, we're just going to pause for a second. We know some people have only got an hour, and we're happy that you've been able to join us for that time. But we do hope that many of you will choose to stay on for another 30 minutes, because that will be the time when all of us can really get together and share our thoughts and discuss together, not just ask questions of the panel, but ask questions of each other, share our experiences and so on. So we will have that opportunity for 30 minutes towards the end of our time together. So that's the way that our time is going to be structured. So let's move on to our first set of panelists, as we're calling them. So we have 2 authors who contributed to the last issue. We have Roei Hillel and we have Mike Wessels. who are going to share thoughts on their papers, which have several interesting features in common. So Roei is a licensed clinical social worker. He's currently working in mental health and psychosocial support director of Humanity Crew. He specializes in psychotherapy with children and youth who are survivors of sexual violence and has been working in the humanitarian field for over 8 years. In his work, he aims to focus on 3 main issues to create more comprehensive MHPSS interventions. Those are decolonization, intersectoral humanitarian work, and community building, all as a means to create more holistic responses to humanitarian disasters. So welcome, Roei. And we also have Mike Wessels, PhD, who is a psychologist and practitioner who's worked in community-based MHPSS, child protection and peace building in conflict-affected settings for over 30 years. He served as the co-chair of the task force that developed the IASC guidelines on mental health and psychosocial support in emergency settings, and he's now Professor Emeritus at Columbia University. He accompanies and co-learns with community-led child protection processes in Sierra Leone, Kenya, and India. And Mike, you're very welcome. We're happy you could both join us. So Mike and Roei have both contributed papers to the last issue, and the theme that draws these 2 papers together is localization of MHPSS. So the 2 papers focus on the need to foreground the knowledge, experience, and skills of local MHPSS actors, and they both note a shift towards the use of evidence-based MHPSS interventions, the use of packages that can be scaled up, and technical capacity building for MHPSS actors in low and middle income countries. And of course, while these approaches have value, they tend to privilege technical expertise over local knowledge. The authors note the risk that this emphasis can lead to the imposition of Western-oriented approaches, which may fail to meet the needs of communities affected by adversity, but also can undermine the sense of agency and dignity, which are at the heart of well-being. So I'm looking forward to hearing their thoughts on these issues. And I'd like to invite both of you, maybe beginning with you, Roei, to reflect on the importance of localization in your work and maybe for MHPSS in general.
Sure. Thank you, first of all, for the introduction, and nice to meet you, everyone. I'm very happy to be here. I think that localization, I see it as a very critical aspect of humanitarian work, especially in the field of MHPSS. I think, first of all, the historical context of the field of humanitarian work is very much rooted in colonialism and serving colonial powers, and it's something that we've been discussing for many years now. And localization can really offer a different lens to conduct a more thorough examination of its negative impacts on communities that have been colonized. And that can happen only if localization goes beyond the empty rhetoric that we're using and that I was using as well in my research. I think it's a pathway to transform practices in order to decolonize the field. I think, first of all, excluding people in the global north or in the Western world from being considered locals, that really perpetuates some sort of a narrative of superiority, and it reinforces the colonial legacies. So we need to broaden the understanding of what is localization, what are locals, who are locals, and then involve more diverse voices so we can create an atmosphere that is more equitable. I think what leads me in my work is that genuine localization really involves meaningful participation of marginalized individuals throughout the entire process of MHPSS programming. So if we're talking about from idea conception to execution, if we're talking about research, program response, policy development, and it means to fight bias practices. If we're talking about grant eligibilities, funding criteria, application processes, I think many things that we see both as mental health professionals, but also people who work with communities, and also people who work in UN agencies. There are many obstacles and challenges in that sense. And I think the main thing that we should do is try to reflect on if what we're doing is actually the continuation of this colonization in some ways. And I think that that's how we can create a more equitable, justice-based field.
Thank you very much. And yeah, I'm sure we'll come back to some of those points that you've made later and hopefully explore them a bit more. But I'd love to hear from you as well, Mike, on this question.
Thank you, Rebecca. Well, I agree with Roei's remarks about the colonizing approach that's prevalent in the field. And I think what it does is it challenges us in a healthy way to think about how to enable greater power sharing. And so I think to do that, we have to enable local people to make the decisions, to be in the driver's seat. And I think that that is a matter of recognizing their agency, not just recognizing their voice, but actually appreciating their knowledge, their own power to determine their future and to engage in appropriate decision-making. And, you know, from a psychosocial lens, Rebecca, I would say these are right at the heart of well-being. There's no well-being if you have no voice and agency. And to be told that you're just a beneficiary, I think is really quite infantilizing and even demeaning. The other thing that we're learning about is the importance of local ownership. Without ownership, we get programs that are less effective, where there's not much uptake of the key interventions that we're developing, and sustainability is low. But with ownership, we can get those things. And this means that local people have to see the actions as their own, and then to mobilize their own resources, their own vision of what's going to happen, and then put their resources to work. This, in the end, produces a highly contextual approach that takes culture, history, politics, economics seriously, because local people intermingle those in ways that the humanitarian sector does not. And I think it calls us to recognize that grassroots workers, natural helpers, people in youth groups, women's groups, religious groups, they're really good problem solvers, and we have a lot to learn from them. So for me, this is not just a matter of creating space so that they can do great work. We have a lot to learn from them. And it's in the cross-fertilization of ideas, going both directions, from north to south and from south to north, that we all stand to make MHPSS a more effective set of actions for people in difficult settings. Thanks.
Thank you. Again, lots to explore there. But the second question I'd like to ask in this short introductory discussion really is whether you could reflect on what the potential obstacles are to redressing this balance, so that local knowledge and expertise is valued and incorporated into MHPSS research and practice. So what might these obstacles be? And do you have any thoughts on how they could be overcome? Shall we begin with you again, Roei?
Sure. I'll try to cover everything in a few minutes. I think the first thing that I'm thinking of, I wrote in my study on funding, and I think that another view to funding in localization is viewing localization as an act of cost reduction. I think instead of genuinely really investing in local leadership and resources and putting a lot of effort in strengthening grassroots organizations, like Mike said, some organizations may view localization as a way to achieve similar outcomes with fewer financial commitments, and that's something that we're seeing a lot, especially in the field straight after emergencies. So I think something about the level of professionalism that needs to stay with localization. That's one thing. I think another obstacle would be a superficial implementation of localization. It really talks about a situation where localization is implemented in a very surface level. when we're just saying, go contextualize your modality. Go talk to someone from the community to rethink about it. I think it's not enough. It's maybe it's a good act to start with, but the statement in the end is just we're ticking a V, instead of actually going deeper to understand if this intervention can actually work and be accessible to the people who need it. Another one is the challenge of recognizing local knowledge and local talents. Many times we put a lot of barriers of mental health professionals from different backgrounds who maybe don't have an academic degree, or local healers from different traditions. And sometimes people do not count them as MHPSS professionals. And I think that's a big barrier in understanding what the community can actually serve to itself. And also, I think the modalities themselves that we're using, we are often basing most of our knowledge on Western universities and colleges, but also on big known psychologists like Freud. I'm not sure if Freud is always the person to go to in an emergency, and also not cross-culturally. And I think that there's something in the approach and the modalities that we use that needs to be regularly updated. For example, I'm just thinking many MHPSS interventions focus on emotional regulation. Emotional regulation is completely based on the context and the culture that the person is coming from. And just one of the many topics that we face. I think that overall, what it takes is a complete shift in how we see our role in localization. It means more than just shifting resources. It means giving the voice to people to make decisions on themselves and actually trust local leaders. So it means that if there are already organizations and local leaders who work in a certain place, they need to lead the MHPSS efforts. They need to be in our technical working groups. They need to be a part of advocacy groups after emergencies. Yeah, I think these are the main thoughts.
Thank you very much. And Mike, over to you.
Thanks, Rebecca. Well, I think it is a complex system. And to begin with, in the humanitarian enterprise, there are a whole set of structural, economic, political factors that relate to funding, knowledge, and power. And that nexus, as Roei has said, is really dominated by Western and Northern global powers. And I think it is hugely culture-bound, individualistic, and asymmetric. It really does not recognize the value of what local people themselves have to offer. And it risks trampling ideas that come from alternate cosmologies. So for example, many indigenous peoples don't define themselves as individuals. They relate very carefully to place and to earth and sky and water. And these are things that really don't enter into DSM and ICD ideas, so we need to be attentive to them. And then, of course, there are donor demands to pre-specify your programs, to work according to fixed time frames. It leaves very little space for community people to bring forward their own ideas and creativity. But I would say that some of the factors that are most significant are along the lines of what Roei has indicated. There's a huge listening gap, I would say, in MHPSS, but also in child protection. And we don't listen to people's own views about what they see as the most important problems, nor do we pay adequate attention to what they see as the appropriate means of addressing those problems. And I think this comes from our training and from an expert mindset. If we get hired as a consultant to come in as an MHPSS quote expert, then we feel empowered, and even that it's necessary to come in and do, an assessment that's based on our categories, our ideas. And the end result is that we don't act with much humility. We don't really listen. And so I think what's really needed here is a transformation of ourselves and our relation to local people. If we continue to view ourselves as the experts, we continue that colonial path. If we view ourselves, on the other hand, as co-learners and share power, but are really willing to learn from local people, we get farther. But I want to caution that localization, simply handing things over financially and programmatically to local people, is also leaves a lot of complexities of power dynamics potentially unaddressed. And it's not necessarily for outsiders to address, but I just wanted to name that every community has a local power elite. Typically, men are privileged over women. People with disabilities and such are oftentimes marginalized, and that needs to change. So I think what I'm calling for is an approach that's more reflexive, attentive to inclusivity and to the voice and power of all human beings, and that we have to learn together how to create these things. And if we do that and have approaches that are driven by local people, I think we'll get more holistic, grounded approaches to MHPSS. Thanks.
Thank you, Mike. And as you were talking, I'm thinking about in your paper also, you talk quite a lot about humility. And I think that's also perhaps it's coming through in what you've said, but it's a feature that perhaps we could work on a little bit more if you can work on humility. So thank you, both of you. You've given us a lot to think about there. And I'm tempted to take advantage of my position, being able to open my mic, to ask you some more questions, but I'll not. Rina, do we have questions from others?
So all is clear for now. So I think if you have a follow-up question, Rebecca, you have the floor.
Thank you. Lucky me. I was interested, Roei, in your first response. You raised a point that I'd not actually thought of before when you said, I think you said something along the lines of who are locals, and if we don't talk about people like Western people as locals, then that's sort of perpetuating colonialism. Did I understand that correctly? And if so, could you just say a little bit more about that? And maybe, Mike, you might also have something on who are the locals that we're talking about.
Yeah, I think there's something about this term that, first of all, the reason why I chose to call my article decolonizing MHPSS is because I think that's the issue. I think that localization sometimes is washing the actual word, which is colonization. I think that in this sense, when we're looking at people only from the global south as locals, we don't understand that first of all, people in the global north also have culture, and this culture is also different than what we know as the Western modalities. And that's one thing. And the second thing is that they also need this contextualization. The people from the global south can actually teach them from their own methods. Mindfulness did not come from Europe initially. So yeah, I think that's fine.
Thank you for that clarification. Did you have anything, Mike, you wanted to add to that?
Just one note, it is that the term localization is used in so many different ways that it's really difficult to pin down what it means. And even when we're focused on people in low and middle income countries, I think that there's a real risk that we will miss what's most important. An example for me is, for example, for donors like USAID, a local actor can mean a national government. So localization means giving money and putting power in the hands of anyone, any actors. in those countries. And that worries me a lot, because my experience is that oftentimes governments, of course, are the perpetrators of discrimination and human rights violations. Very few governments, certainly the US government, that don't have a good record with regard to enabling the voice and power of marginalized peoples. And so, I think we really have to interrogate the power dynamics very, very carefully. And one of the things that would really be unfortunate is if the localization movement became focused primarily on money. I mean, I think Roei is right and has done us a service to take a look at the funding. But at the end of the day, as he said, it's not about the funding. It's about the processes. It's about what happens to help people who are in difficult situations. And we're not attending to that. It has not been a central feature of the localization discourse, but it ought to be.
Thank you very much. I hope we can come back to these issues. Rina, do we have was there another question, or should we?
Yes, I have two bigger questions that I hope we can address in the half an hour we still have at the end. But one smaller question from Caroline. She's asking, sorry, I missed the first point of who are the locals we are talking about, actually.
Would either of you like to respond to Caroline briefly?
I think we asked whether the term locals, just like maybe like we call expats, it's usually white people who work abroad, but people who look for jobs are usually settlers or refugees. So I think just the same for locals. Who are locals? Are there locals in the global north? How do we contextualize also information for them? And what is the role of the global south in localizing these things with the global?
Thank you very much. Thank you, Roei, and thank you, Mike. Oh, Mike, yes, please.
Yeah, just very quickly, I wanted to mention that for me, the term locals, whether it applies in the global north or the global south, does not refer only to organizations. It's important that it, of course, includes organizations, but ordinary parents are locals, in my view. Ordinary communities are local people, as are the refugees, the migrants, the disadvantaged people who are sometimes invisible within those communities. So, but I think that it does, for me, it would be a mistake to equate governments and states with locals. I think that that is a very different kind of issue.
Thank you, and thanks, Caroline, for prompting that clarification from our panelists. And we will come back to talk more to our panelists, our two panelists. That's not easy to say later. But I'd like to introduce us now to our second two panelists. Getting better at that word. On our second theme, which has a lot in common with our first theme, and it's to do with teaching of non-specialists. And non-specialists providing MHPSS support. So we have with us Rozane El Masri and Megan Douglas. You're both very welcome. Really pleased to have you with us today. So Rozane is a public health researcher with extensive experience in leading research projects in humanitarian global mental health, particularly in Lebanon. As a former research coordinator at War Child, she played a pivotal role in coordinating the EQUIP study in Lebanon. And if you want to know more about that, you can read her paper in Intervention. This study resulted in the development of the WHO and UNICEF EQUIP competency assessment platform. Rozane's currently working as a research consultant for the GOAL project at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and is responsible for coordinating various work packages aimed at strengthening the capacity of the health system to address the mental health needs of Syrian refugees and vulnerable communities in Lebanon. So welcome, Rozane. And alongside Rozane, we have Megan Douglas, who holds a PhD in International Development from the University of Edinburgh. Until recently, Megan worked as a refugee integration coordinator with the Edinburgh-based charity Edinburgh City Mission. And she writes about this in her paper in Intervention, very interestingly. She has extensive experience in the non-profit and humanitarian sectors, with particular interest in disaster relief and refugee integration. She's the co-founder and COO of BeDo, an emotional well-being consultancy focusing on building the resilience of frontline workers. She's currently a teaching fellow within the Centre for African Studies at the University of Edinburgh, where she coordinates the development of a master's programme in partnership with the MasterCard Foundation for African Scholars. So Megan, you're very welcome too, and such a wide range of experiences between the two of you. I'm looking forward to hearing more. So as I mentioned, the theme of this second panel is teaching of non-specialists, and both Rozane and Megan have papers in the last issue of Intervention. And they're quite different, actually. It'll be interesting to compare the two and compare the thoughts of the two authors. The two papers focus in different ways on the role of non-specialists in providing MHPSS support. So in one case, this is through a formal MHPSS programme, and in the other case, it's through informal voluntary support. But both focus on how to ensure that the non-specialists are supporting others in ways that are helpful. And Megan also reflects on the well-being of the non-specialists themselves as they do this type of support. So I have a question for both of you to begin with. I'd like you, if you can, please, to tell us something about how the involvement of non-specialists contributes to the effectiveness of the programme that you're involved with and to the MHPSS field in general. So shall we begin with you, Rozane?
Sure, thank you, Rebecca. So in the context of, so thank you for the introduction. When it comes to involving non-specialists, of course, everyone agrees the importance and the value of involving non-specialists, also as a way and a great solution for the shortage of mental health professionals in humanitarian settings and lower middle income countries. Via their involvement, we are able to ensure that people has access to the service they need, especially at the time when service providers and specialized service providers are not there. The benefits of involving non-specialists, I believe, were highly highlighted in the previous panel, bridging the gap between formal mental health services and local communities with their understanding of local knowledge and culture. The importance of fostering ownership in the community, which can also lead to more sustainable interventions through the creation of the sense of responsibility towards services, can also lessen the stigma around mental health services and lead to better normalization of therapy. The challenge, however, which is also highlighted in the paper, is ensuring that the non-specialists that are involved are up to the standards in terms of their competencies and preparedness to deliver the intervention properly to the population. And unlike associations that assess the competencies of MHPSS professionals, there is a lack of standardized systems and mechanism for checking whether non-specialists achieve a minimum level of competency to support effective and safe delivery of care. And a valuable way to observe behaviors and assess competency of the non-specialists working in delivering MHPSS intervention is via standardized role plays, where a person can show their skills prior to real-world delivery by facilitating a session in a controlled setting with a simulated intervention participants. And this is the approach applied on the EQUIP platform, which is also we speak about during in our paper. The EQUIP platform is offering this role-play-based competency assessment. And what we have done in Lebanon, role-play assessments were conducted with the non-specialized facilitators prior to their real-world delivery of intervention with the participant. We have prepared a group of raters on identifying and rating different competencies for working with children and caregivers, a group of actors on acting out different scenarios with the non-specialized facilitators, when facilitating the session with children and caregivers as well. And we have also prepared the raters. The preparation of raters also, the raters who are responsible to rate the competencies of the non-specialists. The preparation of raters involved the establishment of what we call the inter-rater reliability scores, which were used to assess the readiness of the raters to go and rate the real-life sessions with children and caregivers and assess the competencies of the non-specialists. So I think this is how it is, how we have done it. I think this was one of the ways we have found to be very useful in identifying what needs to be improved in the competencies of non-specialists in our work.
Thank you. Thank you. Sorry, Rozane, did you have something else?
No, I think this is it in brief, my answer to your question.
That's great. Thank you so much. Looking forward to hearing more in a moment, but I'd love to hear from you, Megan. So in your context, which is quite different, how does the involvement of non-specialists contribute to the effectiveness of your initiative, let's call it?
Thank you. Well, quite a different context, but some interesting parallels with Rozane's case study of the need for perhaps greater capacity building among non-specialists for effective intervention. So as Rebecca mentioned, I was a refugee integration coordinator at a Edinburgh-based faith-based organization. So I helped to organize volunteer efforts and coordinate volunteers and help put together social events for refugees and asylum seekers in Scotland, which we call New Scots here, to help them feel welcome in the city. So at present, there's limited government funding and very strained public resources, including mental health professionals. So there's an increasing reliance on local volunteers in holistically assisting New Scots to adjust to life in a new country and making the country feel like a welcoming place. So they serve as very important mediators, helpers, and friends within the process of localizing resettlement and integration. And it also broadens our conceptualization of who are the locals, as Roei and Mike were discussing earlier. So in our case, we had a very limited staff within the organization. And so programming was almost entirely facilitated by local non-specialized volunteers. And they were primarily members of local Christian churches, which we partnered with, but not exclusively. And so we worked so much with volunteers, both because of capacity restraints with our very limited staff, but also because we had a genuine belief of the importance of engaging with the local community to help welcome New Scots into Scotland. So our volunteers developed very close and regular bonds with New Scots. They would sometimes meet multiple times a week. They would sit and have countless cups of coffee. They would tour the city together and engage in what I call very intimate labor of language learning and arts and crafts, which were highly introspective. So there was a physical and an emotional proximity that was between the volunteers and the New Scots that was unique and was not replicated by any specialist service provider. So as a result, it was often the non-specialist volunteers who would serve as a sort of a frontline worker and see firsthand the compounding challenges to mental health that were affecting the New Scots, including language barriers, inadequate housing, social discrimination, and difficulty accessing specialist social services. So these volunteers operated at a very blurry boundary between friend, confidant, teacher, and therapist. And on the one hand, it may have been precisely because they were not formal doctors or mental health specialists that the New Scots felt comfortable disclosing their distress to them, as they may have felt a more equitable balance of power. But on the other hand, and I talk about this in my entry into the journal, power imbalances were certainly not erased. And we had to continuously encourage ways of combating the us and them mentality that so easily arises when one is positioned as the carer and the other as the cared for. And we also had to be attentive to the mental health and well-being of the volunteers, because as non-specialists with little or no training in mental health or trauma-informed care, they were at risk of taking on secondary or vicarious trauma.
Thank you, Megan. Oh gosh, a lot there as well. I'd love to explore, but I have another question for you. It's a big question and we have very little time, so let's see how you go with this. The question is, what would be your key recommendations for training and working with non-specialists in MHPSS? And let's reverse the order this time. I'll begin with you, Megan, and then come to you, Rozane.
Great. So for the sake of time, I've narrowed it down to kind of 3 main points. Firstly, as I mentioned, the majority of our volunteer base was white, older Christian females, which is a replication of the typical volunteer base in the UK. So the challenge of not necessarily understanding the cultural appropriateness of certain responses to stress, and as well as potentially continuing that colonization of mental health, can be mitigated by really striving for diversity and representation among non-specialist volunteers. So as Mike mentioned earlier, it's really vital that beneficiaries of programming have a stake in it for the sake of efficacy and sustainability. So we did make efforts to engage New Scots in the planning, evaluation, and facilitation of the programming, made incredibly difficult due to language barriers, but absolutely crucial. Next, as I mentioned, it's really important to remember that non-specialist volunteers are often put into very blurry categories of volunteer, friend, and sometimes therapist. So even though their job title is volunteer or tutor, sometimes what they're actually doing is informally providing psychosocial work. And so capacity building and specialized training like trauma sensitivity and cultural competency is key, as well as really focusing on the core skills of active listening and empathetic communication and basic psychological first aid. Those are things that can be provided to grow that capacity building. And lastly, because boundaries are blurred, it's vital to have them. You have to have boundaries, and non-specialists have to be aware of their role and their limitations. So empathetic listening is incredibly powerful, but it does have its limitations, particularly when engaging with somebody who has deep traumas from war and displacement. So it's vital to establish really clear referral pathways for volunteers to provide so that they can refer individuals like New Scots with complex mental health needs to appropriate specialists or services.
Great recommendations there, Megan. Thank you so much. And over to you, Rozane. What would be your recommendations?
Thank you, Rebecca. I believe like in the involvement of non-specialists should definitely also be supported by appropriate training and supervision. And competency assessment with the EQUIP platform can be the way. With EQUIP, we have found a valuable way to observe behaviors and assess competency via standardized role play, where a person can show their skills prior to real-world delivery. As was highlighted by Megan, because of the low resources often in the settings we work in, it is recommended to use existing resources within organizations to train on what is needed for the implementation of competency-based assessment or whatever capacity building that is being done or needs to be done for the training of these non-specialists. When considering using a role-play competency assessment, one recommendation would be is to use the existing resources for the adaptation of the tools that are available on the platform. For instance, ensure proper time is being given for anyone involved in the training of these non-specialists, whether they are the raters or the actors, and giving enough time for these people to be familiar, but also be transparent with them throughout the process of giving them the feedback that they need, for them to be aware of what needs to be improved or what is being done that needs to be maintained. Yeah, I believe this is it in brief.
Thank you very much. I think this theme of taking time might come through in much of what is said by, in fact, all of the panelists. So maybe we'll talk about that more in the last 30 minutes. And also the issue of power sharing is really coming through, isn't it, strongly in everything that we're talking about. And your paper, Megan, is actually called Us and Us, isn't it? Which is a nice twist on us and them. We have a couple of minutes. Rina, do we have any questions? Clarification questions or points from these panelists?
Not for now, so you're welcome to post yours again.
Thank you, I will. If I get the chance, I will. Thank you. I was interested in listening to you and reading both of your papers, but within this category of non-specialists, we have volunteers and we have professionals from other sectors who don't have an MHPSS background, and we talk about them all as non-specialists, but they seem to be quite different kind of groups of people in terms of how they provide MHPSS support. And I wondered whether, and yes, just different types of non-specialists, I wondered whether either of you or both of you might have some reflections on that.
Is your question just relating to kind of breaking down kind of the generalization of the non-specialist group?
Non-specialists, exactly. I feel like there might be specific challenges. Initially, I thought specific challenges related to working with volunteers, but then I thought, no, there is probably some specific challenges and strengths in working with specialists, perhaps from other sectors without an MHPSS background. So I was just interested in that contrast. And I know it's difficult because both of you work with just one of those two groups. I just wondered if you had any reflections on it.
I mean, it's a good point that you can't, you can't generalize any group of people, including non-specialist volunteers. And I think it is important to kind of pick apart the nuances and the different characteristics and backgrounds. I would say, you know, we had some volunteers who were specialists in their field and some who were specialists within the medical field. So we had a couple midwives, for example. We also had a dentist come in. So sometimes these were individuals that we've reached out to in a targeted effort to bring in specialists to speak about that sector industry and how individuals could access them and what to expect when they go for their first appointment. And sometimes they just sort of organically became volunteers because they were interested. I would say that those individuals definitely had a better handle on kind of referral pathways and systems of accessing social services within Scotland and the UK. You know, they were perhaps much more kind of accustomed to working with, you know, the client-based relationship. So yes, I would say that's an important differentiation to make.
Yeah.
Yes, Rozane.
In my context, I believe like the non-specialists that we worked with were mostly like entry-level and professionals who are not professionals in the field of MHPSS, but could have an education that is completely different to psychology or psychiatry, but people who have the interest and the willingness to take part in these kind of trainings and to receive the trainings that they need. So we don't necessarily, when we speak about non-specialists, it's not that they are less valued or so, but because they do have the knowledge and they do have the expertise. It could be that they have facilitated so many, they have experience in facilitation that is very good, but it's not in that field. So this is the way we have been using this term. I'm not sure I answered your question, but
you gave a great answer.
And
sorry,
Megan. Oh, it's just to say, maybe I should have prefaced with that. Yeah, I think Rozane and I have the same definition. I mean, everybody is a specialist in something in their own way. All of our volunteers have their own specializations from many different fields. But yes, for the context of this discussion, I think about non-specialists in MHPSS.
That's true. Perhaps we should find a better term. Thank you both. Thank you both. Oh, Rina, do we have a question?
Yes, two actually. We have one question/comment from somebody anonymous, and she's saying, or he is saying, I'm grateful to Megan and Rozane for emphasizing time needed for training. We must all start pushing back on demands for trainings to be brief and cheap, including for non-specialists. As a sector, we must change our approach to training and improve skills competencies, but also embrace localization of our work. Listening and co-creating, which should be part of training, takes time. So I think, well, I see a lot of nodding, so I think more like an encouragement from what has been said. And then there is a question specifically for Megan from Leila. And she's saying, I'm interested in the specified role of volunteers. Can Megan say more about the role as tutors?
Sure. So one of the programs that I was part of was a weekly English class for Afghan women. So these were all individuals who were here in the country as refugees, and we partnered with a local church to provide space as well as a group of volunteers. So we would meet regularly and engage with volunteers to help lead the classes, sit at each of the tables to help facilitate the language lessons. So many of them sort of took on that teacher-tutor role, but language learning was only one element of the class. We wanted it to be holistic, like all of our programming. So a big component was also just having time to sit, catch up, and listen. We also did arts and crafts. So it certainly wasn't just language, but that kind of teacher role was one of the many roles that volunteers would take on.
Thank you, Megan. And I think in the paper itself, you do describe a little bit more, don't you, about what went on? Yeah, thank you. Rina, do we have another question? Do we have time for another question?
I think we have to pause the questions for after the 1 hour break and start with the key takeaways for now.
Lovely. Well, we'll come back. Whoever's question that was, we haven't forgotten it. We've tracked it and we'll come back to it. So we are coming up to our 1 hour mark, and we'd like to ask, as we approach this, for the panelists to reflect on having shared their thoughts and listened to others. What do they feel are the key takeaways from this webinar? So I hope panelists, you're ready for this question. I'll go in the kind of order that we went in to begin with. So that means that Roei, you go first. If you have a key takeaway, we'd love to hear it. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a thought that came up now. I think that what Megan and Rozane talked about, the training of non-MHPSS specialists, that could be a very good thing to do in order to localize interventions. Seeing communities as specialists who are not MHPSS specialists. And I think that focusing also on their training should be something that we focus on.
Thank you. I love that link between the two panels. Thanks for making that. Mike, do you want to go next?
Yeah, thanks, Rebecca, and thanks everyone. You know, I think both panels remind us that we need to change our approach. And coming back to the issue of humility, you know, we need to be cautious about imposing our own knowledge, recognizing all that we don't know, and inviting learning from people in the context who really understand it with a depth and in a way that we never will. And then we need to work, as has been said, according to community time, not according to donor time or NGO time, build deep trust. And I would say that our role is multiple. One of the things we can do is to respectfully accompany people in their hour of need. We can also engage in co-learning and document some of the key things they do, share with them some of the things that are working in other places to see what they think of those. We can enable inclusivity, and we can, as I mentioned, document and share learning as we move forward. And if we do this, I think what happens is we all join hands as equals in the process of learning and supporting. And I think that would be a sea change that could be quite helpful. So thanks.
Thank you, Mike. Lots to discuss already in what we've heard from our two panelists in terms of takeaways. So Rozane, shall we come to you next?
Of course. So I think the main key takeaway from the discussion And since our webinar is on localization, and part of localization of MHPSS is also building the capacity of local people, empowering them to lead programs and interventions. Coming from the context of the paper, with the Equip platform, we have provided a roadmap for how to build the competency and capacity of individuals and locals via competency-based feedback and role-play-based interventions. Feedback is an important element in improving the local capacity and ensuring quality of MHPSS interventions by allowing the chance to learn continuously, indicating what needs to be improved, and giving something tangible for the non-specialists who are delivering to work on. So via continuous feedback and assessment. So this is one of the ways I can conclude my discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Megan, over to you.
As Rozane said, capacity building is absolutely vital. And I would add to that, we must remember that there are often significant emotional and psychological impacts for non-specialists, including burnout and vicarious stress disorder. So anybody who is serving sort of on the front lines should receive specialist training and be aware of referral pathways so that they can really maintain healthy boundaries of what services they should not be offering.
Thank you very much. And thank you to all of our panelists. You've given us lots to think about and discuss. I've got lots of notes that I would like to discuss with you all. And I hope that many of you who are here as participants will join me in that. So we're now coming to the 1 hour point, and we are aware that for some people, it's only possible to join us for the first hour. So if you do need to leave us, then thank you so much for joining us. We're very happy to have had you with us. And if you've posted a question, we will be sharing them as frequently asked questions at some point later. If you still have a question, then do still post it. We'll save it and we'll try to answer it in the discussion that will come in the next 30 minutes. So if you need to leave us, then goodbye. Thank you for joining us. I do hope that the majority of you are still with us and will remain with us for the next 30 minutes, because this will be our chance to really connect and discuss some of the many ideas that have come out of this conversation so far. I'm looking at the number of participants. I don't see it dropping greatly, so that's really encouraging. I do hope that at this point it's going to be possible for some of you to raise your hands and open your mics. I'm not sure what Zoom allows when we have webinars, but I know that we do have some questions in the chat. Some bigger questions that I think, Rina, we were going to share at this point. Do you have some that you can share, or I can look in the chat myself?
Sure, no, I can do that.
Thank you.
just to say, like, a lot of thank yous are coming in, and people are saying lots to think about, really great inspiration to think about in my own work. So that's nice to hear. I'll just go through them as they came in, so there's no specific order. I think they were all liked by many of the participants. So first of all, Tessa had a question for the panel saying, what would be a perfect MHPSS collaboration between institutions and organizations from the Global South and the Global North look like? Should there even be a role for the Global North in this collaboration?
Okay, that's a great question, a big question. Yeah. I'm going to just talk for a couple of seconds to give people a chance to gather their thoughts and to see whether any of our panelists have something that they would like to share. Or Tessa, do you want to explain the question a little bit? It's great we can see you and hear you.
Yeah,
please go ahead.
I was out of the Zoom meeting for a little bit when I changed from participant to host, but I don't think I missed anything. Yeah, so my question was indeed like regarding like what would a perfect collaboration look like, and an assumption which was part of this question, but I didn't jot down, was that it would be then a collaboration focused on an MHPSS programming in the Global South. So in that sense, what would be the role of the Global North, and should there even be a role for Global North institutions or organizations in such a collaboration in a perfect world? So that's my question.
Thank you, Tessa. Great question. Any of our panelists have thoughts on that they'd like to share?
I think. I think that in localization, people from the Global North have to be a part of the conversation, mainly because we have a big role in it, and in colonization. And I think that if we talked before about the local actors and who are locals, I think that it needs to be somewhat mutual, like and if the question is about academia, did I get it right, or no? Is it about the programming?
Well, for me, it's interesting. I work at the university, so academia would be interesting. But yeah, it could also be the case for non-academic partnerships, of course. Yeah.
Okay, so I'll just say not about academia, and then I'll let all the people from academia to respond. But about MHPSS programming, I think a lot of the in the recent years, we've seen a lot of different programs that really involve people from different backgrounds, like EQUIP, for example, that has been doing really good research. And what I imagine is more about the funding, like seeing how universities from the Global South can host maybe some of the research rather than other institutions. That's what caught me in my mind.
Rebecca, I have an idea as well. I
Please.
mean, I think that the first thing that we can do is be respectful and to listen and to learn and support. And on a deeper level, I think that we will continue to have relevant knowledge to share. I mean, recognizing all the sins that have been created, that have occurred in the context of imposition of outsider knowledge, I think it would be wrong to throw Western knowledge out the window. I think it's a mistake to throw the knowledge of any culture out the window. It's really about how we carry it. So I would hope that one of the things that we would do as Northerners would be to really champion the cause of documenting and learning from many different local areas. And then maybe within our own countries, we would find new ways to interrogate our power dynamics and the ways in which we have daily silenced the well-being of and voices of people in very difficult situations, and thereby transform our own structures and processes. And so on a research level, I would say that we need to form really important partnerships that are led by local people, where the questions come from them. And we have methodological and other expertise that we can bring, but it should not be made ascendant over the methods and the voices of the local people. Thanks.
Thank you, Mike. And I think, Megan, did I see you on mute earlier? Did you have something to add?
Oh, I was just maybe a concrete example, and it's just me kind of putting on a different hat. I'm not speaking anymore from the nonprofit I was referencing earlier, but now my current employer, which is the MasterCard Foundation Scholars Program at the University of Edinburgh, I think might be a good example of a partnership, as Mike was talking about. So for African scholars who access the MasterCard Foundation scholarships, the university has partnered with a Rwandan-based mental health services program organization called Working Minds, which really uses localized understandings and approaches to mental health, which is appropriate and relevant to some African students, of course, not all. but that option is made available to students. So it's sort of the university kind of letting go of the reins, even though they have their own internal counseling services. It started with consultations with students. What are you interested in? What do you need? What do you want? And then looking for suitable partners and partnering with Working Minds and providing funding for those services to be offered, but not actually providing those mental health services themselves. So I thought that was kind of a cool example.
Yeah, it's great to hear that example from a different perspective there, Megan. So thank you for sharing that. Tessa, would you like? Oh yes, Rozane, please.
Yeah, I also wanted to add to what the other panelists mentioned, an example of also ways to do that, which is also part of my recent work, is really like the term that started to appear in the academia is co-production, when you actually co-produce things with local people. And what we are doing in the Goal project, for instance, which is another project I'm working on, is we are making sure that throughout the collaboration with from the global south to the global north, we are being more mindful of the process. We are putting these reflections on power dynamics between local researchers and other researchers as well, and it requires a lot of commitment from the people themselves to actually make sure that that everyone is really truly giving their chance to not only like be consulted on things, but rather have a major role in programming, but also in whatever is a major aspect of the research, for instance, or the program. So it requires lots of reflections throughout the process and commitment from the people from the global north first, because they hold the most power, right? Like in terms of power dynamics. So it requires effort, it requires commitment, but it also like very like when we adopt this co-production approach, that we all produce things and we all contribute similarly, equally. Yeah, it can really pays along have a very positive impact overall on the programs when it comes to localization and empowering people. Yeah.
Thank you, Rozane, for sharing another really helpful, concrete example. And the term that came out from what you were saying there for me was this reflexivity and reflecting. And I think that's also in your paper, Mike, where you talk about the need for all of us to continually reflect with others, and the time so the things that are striking me in all our conversations, the time involved in these things, the humility, the reflexivity, these are practices which are ongoing, aren't they? So thanks for illustrating that so well, Rozane, with that example. Tessa, is there anything you'd like to come back to from what you've heard?
Well, thank you also very much for giving these concrete examples, as well as like pointers. I think they're very helpful for me, because I think this was also briefly mentioned, like there are these funding structures, and also in academia, but also in general with donor organizations. So it is complex, but hopefully using, for example, your examples, if I ever write another funding proposal, I can say like this is actually working, and yeah, it's good that you write these things so that we can also refer to that. Yeah, thank you so much.
That's great, thank you, Tessa. So Rina, should we go to another question?
Yes, maybe we can ask Annika to unmute, or she can be unmuted. She had a question she wanted to pose as well.
Great. Here she is. Annika, welcome. We can see that you're with us. If you're able to, and you're unmuted. Yes, we can hear you well. Are you able to put your camera on, or is that not possible?
I don't know. You know, I'm quite stupid for computers, and I am not able to do it. So
no problem. We can hear you.
Yes.
We can hear your voice.
I have just a comment. I'm 88 years old. This is very important for my comment, because I went through the Second World War. And in a way, you know, I always think that people survived also without psychologists and psychiatrists, in all the war and atrocities, and after the Second World War, maybe some rich Jews had psychotherapists. Other people had not in Yugoslavia, in Belarus, Ukraine, Poland, where things were really terrible. You do not know because you are young. There were no help for people. And however, I never found some research which would prove that my generation is more troubled than the generation of my sons, let's say. But there were no psychiatrists and no psychologists. This is one thing. The other is that I think that you are really not enough oriented toward natural resources for coping, in a way, for recovering from traumas and losses. We are just, we, Western people, we are just oriented towards specialists. And I think that we overestimate the role of specialists. Quantitatively, this is really neglectful. You have 10 and 10,000 of persons, a million of persons, for instance, in Africa during the Tutsi war, which are traumatized, which went through the worst things, and how many specialists you have who can help them. So I think that we should, in our learning, our academia should much more be oriented towards the activation of natural resources. This is one thing, and the other is of linking our knowledge with natural resources, not started from zero, but looking from bottom up. I can give many examples. For instance, in North Ossetia after Beslan, the very learned psychologists came with hypotherapy. And people were laughing because they said in our mountains, in the mountains of Caucasus, everybody knows that the course is a therapist, is something which helps you when you are in distress. If you give to a child who is unhappy a horse, this will be the best remedy. Or there are many other examples. And also, I heard so many approaches which are really, which are examples of, let's say, behavioral cognitive therapy. I have no time to quote them, but I ask myself, for God's sake, why my country gave so much money for educating me. These people know this, they do this. So to make it short, I think that really we neglect the existing natural resources. We do it also in Western countries, but particularly, of course, in other countries. For instance, teachers, religious leaders, these are immense capital, social capital, which can help people. And believe me, if I'm honest, I'm a child psychiatrist. I did my specialization in pediatrics, in psychiatry, in psychotherapy. So I learned and learned. But if I think what was the most useful in my work in different countries, Afghanistan, Iraq, former Yugoslavia, and so on, it was in the matter of fact activating people, empowering people to use their knowledge, their goodwill, their empathy to help others. And I added just a little knowledge. For instance, they were not familiar with ADHD. They didn't know why these children are so disturbing. They thought that they were not good and so on. And some things like this I could explain to them, but the basic approach is how to help members of families, friends, children, and so on. I learned more from them than they learned from me. And many times we are teaching and preaching things, methods which they will never use. They will listen, they will be enthusiastic because it's so nice to listen good lectures, but they will never implement them. So again, I think, yes, of course, with all my respect to specialists, but they should much more be oriented towards discovering natural resources, activating natural resources, supporting natural resources, and making, how to say, a synthesis between natural resources and the knowledge we have. That's my opinion at the end of my life, after 40 years of working in the humanitarian field.
Thank you so much, Annika, for sharing these thoughts and your experiences from so many years of working with people in distress. I think the quality of the sound was sometimes a bit difficult, but it came through very strongly, the importance of not relying heavily on specialists in so many of these situations, and the role that what you were calling natural resources have. And I think that you mentioned teachers, religious leaders, and so on as being those natural resources. And I would like to give any of our panelists the opportunity to reflect on that briefly, just because of time. But I know that this, well, I feel like this might resonate with some of you, so I would like to give that chance to our panelists, if anyone has anything. I feel like, yeah, Mike, I was looking at
Rebecca,
you because it really reflects with.
It definitely resonates
yeah.
with me. And Annika, thank you so much for your really rich comments, and of course your many decades of incredible work. It's hugely appreciated. So I think what you're inviting us to do is to change our role and to take a intersectoral approach, and to really take seriously the idea that social supports, material supports, these are the things that are oftentimes most meaningful and most important for affected people. And I'm not at all trying to disparage the importance of specialized supports, because they too are important. But I agree with you that too often we go in with a specialized lens. And what you're doing is inviting us to start where local people are. And if people can't find shelter, if they can't afford food, then I think it was really, I think we will get off on the wrong foot. So we should move with local people and build their natural resilience by supporting their natural supports and learning from them, working within. So thank you.
Thank you very much. And I know it's a huge part of the work that you've been doing, Mike, not beginning with, but including the ARQ MHPSS guidelines, which really has a focus on non-specialist support. Thank you again, Annika, for that. And I would love to hear from you, Yvonne. I see that you're there with us. So I think you have a question, do you?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we hear you well.
Okay.
Are you able to put your camera on, or is it difficult?
Maybe if I join as a panelist, okay.
Oh, it's okay. Go ahead. We can hear you. It just would be nice to see you. Sorry, I've complicated matters. I thought it would be a simple thing.
Yeah, okay. I think it's fine now. There we go.
Thank you.
It's been wonderful to hear how what's being said today, I hope this fully becomes the discourse that we are moving to, because people are speaking with such experiences and from the heart around how this can best be done, and the picture is quite clear. so mine were more comments than questions. I do think, I mean, even if people have tried some of these things, because we are talking about what's working, but, you know, some really unfortunate experiences in doing this work where the follow-up funding gets retracted or there isn't ongoing support, and the damage that does when people feel that they're able to do more but need that support. And even if it is for the funders to support some local mentors to help keep programs going. But it's sort of tied up with me around accountability too. And Mike, you've mentioned that, but you know, it's not that the funders only call the shots. There is like the accountability is only to the funders. And what does accountability really look like if we change this discourse in the opposite direction? You know, how do we negotiate with the communities and organizations? What would it look like if the accountability was to the communities or to the organizations, the people that are being served? What would that actually look like? What would they feel, and what is realistic? It takes a difficult. It's not an easy conversation, but that is really when things get named and they become more apparent, and people can be held to that, and we can hold ourselves to that process. And I was just wondering, you know, everything that people are talking about, for this kind of deep process to happen, for this kind of shift to happen on a deep level and to have some sustainability, the donors need to think differently. And could there be like a panel, a round table of donors sitting together having this conversation? Because it is, you know, how do you break away from the statistics and the timeline if the funders don't actually see that it's the process here with lots of unique opportunities that arise? Once you work with people in the way you've described, it takes on new ways of doing things. The outcomes are different. They are not stipulated beforehand in the proposal. So there needs to be that kind of discussion with the funders to see if we can get people on board to support this so that it has sustainability. But thank you very much for everyone for the great contributions that you've made.
And thanks so much for raising this issue, Yvonne. I think it's crucial to reflect on this, and I wonder whether anybody from our panelists would like to add to what Yvonne has been saying.
I can, while they're waiting, just say once a long time ago, I wrote a funding proposal to people using exactly their language, what they wanted to hear, showing that I know what they want, and that's what it looked like. And then wrote another one and said, you know, if we follow this kind of process, this is what it would look like. And the indicators would be negotiated, and all of those things would look very differently. And because I showed that I actually wasn't speaking from a naive point of view, that second proposal got funded in the end, and it was one of, over a 4-year period. But it's just, the power is so located within with the funders right now.
It's so inspiring to hear that it is possible. How any of our panelists would like to add? I'm sort of vaguely looking at you, Roei, because your paper was to do with funding.
I have a lot to say. It just we don't have much time, and I don't want to humble. But I do think that the one really thing that you're saying is about how to make sure that the people who actually donate the money, for example, how do we reach them in this discourse? And in my research, so I used the UN tracking system of funding, and I was wondering what if there would be a body who monitors how much money actually goes to grassroots organizations, and because I think some people need to be monitored in order to change what they actually do, and it needs to come together with the shifting paradigm. So these are the.
So you're talking about even more sort of higher up tracking of accountability, which I think is another side to this. I was really thinking also about if the community were involved, and if, you know, how does it get let's say that people keep saying our livelihoods cause us the biggest stress, then, you know, how can you then negotiate that the multi-sectoral, like Mark mentioned, around working with people around other products that you were talking about, you know, how is it then negotiated that can happen, and what would it look like? So of course you can't then say, okay, you know, we will have to build partnerships, but then partnerships become part of that funding proposal, that the funder has to accept that we are involving the other sectors, and that funders may have to work together more than what they're working now. And we see this with the MHPSS and peace building, with people, you know, working from such different silos. So how do they agree to do the funding that these silos are, that come together as the holistic way in which people experience what is happening to them on the ground?
Yvonne, yes, you've taken us back, haven't you, to the initial discussion between Mike and Roei, I think, to do with for most of us in our lives, we don't see sectors, we just see the issues that are affecting us. And it's a slightly false and artificial distinction, isn't it, which is imposed by the humanitarian system. So I would like, if possible, it's a huge question that you've raised, and I would like to see if we can just have one more question from a different participant, if that's okay, just before we close. We are short of time, and thanks so much for raising the issue, Yvonne. Perhaps it's something we can come back to in a future webinar, because I think there's a lot more discussion to be had, isn't there?
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you. Rina, am I being too optimistic in thinking we can squeeze in one more, or shall we try?
We can try.
Okay, let's try.
I want to give the floor to Leila, if she's here.
Leila, it's great to see you. Please go ahead. We have 1 minute.
Sorry.
No pressure. Oh, you're muted.
Oh, here we go. It's a quick question, but it's a very big one, so please don't take it if you don't have time. But it was more about who decides in local definitions of mental health and well-being, who decides what that is? Who are we talking about?
A very succinct and short question with a huge answer. So would anybody like to attempt that in the short time we've got? Thank you, Leila, for ending on a high note for us. Yes, Megan, please.
I would say ideally the definition is co-produced and arrived at in conjunction with the individuals who are affected and who the services are targeted towards. That's not always the case, but ideally that is how it's done.
Thank you. Beautifully succinct as well. Anybody else would like to add to that before we close? Sorry for the time pressure. This is an awful thing to ask you to do.
Maybe just to add a note of complexity too. Communities are diverse and may have different cosmologies, ethnicities, religious, affiliations, and so on. So there may be a multiplicity. So I agree completely with what Megan says, that we have to ask and respect what people say, and we also have to take note of differences. And I think that's part of the complexity of our work, is that there's no one answer, no one size fits all. But listening to local people is seems the right place to start.
I think that's a perfect point to end on. And to the reminder that about the complexity that I think somebody said earlier, something about if we try to make it too simple, if we try to jump to easy answers, then we're getting it wrong. It's never going to be that way. So thanks for that final reminder, Mike. It's a process, a long process, which involves humility, reflexivity on our part, and it takes time.